The barn door creaked like it hadn't been opened since last thaw. A veil of dust drifted in the sharp winter light as Boaz McKinnon stepped through, the cold hitching its breath against the warmth still trapped in the timber. He was early. Always was. The sun hadn't cracked the horizon yet, but he'd already saddled his gelding, rode 2 miles into town, and now stood in the narrow corridor of Harlan Price's horse barn with the silent patience of a man who didn't rush for much, except maybe grief, that he'd never outrun. He tugged his gloves tighter as he stepped past a row of iron stalls, half watching a dapple gray mare watching him back. Straw clung to his boots. He moved like someone accustomed to silence, a man who didn't expect conversation and didn't offer it either. He was here to buy a workhorse. Nothing more. But something wasn't right. From the back stall, second to the left, came a sound that didn't belong. Not the stomp of hooves or clink of bit. It was breath. A human kind of breath. Ragged. What? Not made for the cold. He froze. Moved slow. Didn't call out. Just stepped around the edge, boots careful not to crunch. There, slumped against the rear wall behind a curtain of old hay bales, was a woman. Her wrists were bound in front of her with twine cut from horse rope. Face mottled with fading bruises, lips split, eyes swollen but sharp with defiance that hadn't yet been beaten out. A faded cotton dress torn at one shoulder. Her boots were missing. Her ankles were scabbed. But her back was straight. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She looked at him and that was all. Looked like someone who'd been looked at too long by the wrong kind of men, and didn't trust the quiet kind either. Boaz didn't speak. He just breathed once, deep through his nose, then crouched. She flinched when he reached toward her wrists. From behind them came the scrape of spurs. "Well, hell," said a voice too smooth for dirt country. "You got in early, McKinnon." Harlan Price. Trim coat, shiny boots, silver hair slicked back like he'd been born smug. He didn't look at the woman. Just stepped past like she was a misplaced saddle. "Horse is a fine beast," Price said, motioning to the next stall over. "You'll like him. Strong shoulders. Steady gait. But I'll sweeten the deal." Boaz didn't rise. He was still crouched beside the woman, untying the knots with fingers that didn't shake. Price clicked his tongue. "She's part of the sale. Call it a bonus." No answer. "She's a runaway. Claimed she was somebody's niece. Turns out she ain't no one's anything. Found her sneaking through my stables 2 weeks back. I've been feeding her. Keeping her out of trouble. You know how it is. Lonely thing like that, someone's gotta make choices for her." The rope fell away. Boaz stood. "She yours?" he asked, voice low, flat. Price laughed. "Come on now. Don't be difficult. You want the horse or not?" Boaz turned. Faced him full on for the first time. "She yours?" There was a silence that pulled at the walls. "She's in my care." Boaz didn't blink. Didn't speak again. He just stepped back, offered his hand to the woman. She didn't take it. But she did stand, slow and stiff, wincing as circulation came back to her legs. She walked out of that stall beside him, barefoot on straw, without speaking a word. Just her and him in that too-silent barn. They didn't take the horse. They took the colt. Outside the wind had picked up, cut like truth. As they walked to Boaz's wagon, folks at the edge of town were already starting to stir. First eyes peeked through curtains. Then the gossip came like thaw melt, slow at first, then rushing. A man like Boaz didn't bring home strange women. A woman like that didn't belong anywhere decent. She sat curled under a wool blanket in the back of his wagon, and he didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. Just stared ahead like she'd seen too much of what came before and didn't dare guess what came next. At the cabin, Boaz opened the door. Lit the lantern. Let her enter first. The hearth was cold, but he laid kindling without words and struck the flint. The fire caught slow then steady. She stayed standing, eyes scanning every inch, looking for exits. He noticed. Said nothing. She still hadn't spoken. He set bread on the table. Warmed coffee. Sat across from her and waited. Not for her story. For her to finish eating. That was all. The woman ate like a starved animal. But her gaze stayed proud. She chewed each bite as though she still had dignity tucked somewhere between her ribs. He slid a folded blanket her way. She hesitated before touching it, then tucked it beneath her elbow, still seated. She wouldn't lie down. Not yet. Not here. Later that night, when Boaz walked outside to check the latch on the barn, he paused. Looked out toward the pines, thick with frost. His breath clouded in the air like smoke. There were no horses tied outside. No payment exchanged. No promises made. Just a woman behind a stall, and a man who didn't believe in leaving people where they weren't meant to be. Inside, the fire cracked. She watched it like it held a language she couldn't speak anymore. But she was listening. Maybe for the first time in a long while. And Boaz? He sat by the window, watching snowfall settle over a fence that had once marked the edge of his sorrow. It no longer felt like a border. It felt like the beginning of something slow, quiet, and unfinished. Something worth staying up to see. And reader, if you've ever found something good where you weren't supposed to be looking, you know already. Sometimes a man goes to buy a horse, and instead brings home the part of himself he thought was gone forever. The first morning she didn't speak. Boaz found her outside at dawn, curled on the porch bench, blanket wrapped tight around her knees, as if she'd never quite stopped waiting for someone to come tear her from it. Her bare feet hovered above the boards, not touching the ground, as though she didn't trust the world enough to land on it just yet. He didn't ask what she was doing out there. He simply handed her a cup of coffee, steam curling into the pale morning, and stood beside her, eyes scanning the hills for something that hadn't yet come. She took the mug with both hands. Didn't drink. Didn't thank him either. And Boaz didn't expect her to. Inside, the fire hadn't died through the night. He'd kept feeding it long after she'd fallen asleep on the floor, cocooned in the same wool blanket he'd once buried his dog in. She hadn't taken the bed. Hadn't even glanced toward the room. Just sat down in the corner like she belonged nowhere. That morning he set out for the north pasture. Fence boards had come loose again, stubborn against the wind. He left her bread, eggs, a basin of clean water. When he returned midday, the food was gone. The basin emptied. But the woman wasn't in the house. He found her in the barn. Not hiding. Just sitting in the hay beside the stall she'd once been bound in. Staring at the dust motes dancing through a beam of light. Boaz stood at the doorway for a moment, watching her. She didn't look up. She was wearing one of his flannel shirts. Swallowed her shoulders whole. Her own torn dress hung from a peg, rinsed and dripping. He didn't ask why she'd washed it. He knew. She meant to leave. But she hadn't yet. Later that afternoon, she lit the stove without asking. Fumbled through his shelves, cracked 2 eggs into a pan. Her hands were bruised but steady. She didn't speak even as the scent of frying yolk filled the kitchen. She placed the plate in front of him. He nodded once. She sat across the room by the window, arms folded, as though putting the table between them would shield her from kindness she couldn't return. He took a bite. Chewed. Sipped water. Delaney. The word slipped like an apology. She looked up. His gaze didn't press her. That your name? He asked. A long silence. Then, barely more than a breath, she said, yes. The sound of it cracked something in the room. Not the walls. Something quieter. Something closer to the heart. She didn't say more. Just watched the last of the light drain from the edge of the hills, the snow catching fire as it went. That evening, Etta McCraw arrived. She knocked with the back of her knuckles and didn't wait to be invited in. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair, wrapped in a sage-green shawl that had seen more winters than most of the town combined. She brought thread and sugar, though Boaz hadn't asked for either. Her eyes flicked to Delaney, still by the fire, still small as if bracing for ridicule, and didn't soften but didn't harden either. Well, Etta said, setting her basket down. The wind's turned mean. Boaz nodded. It's going to freeze by morning. Etta shifted her gaze. She staying long? Boaz didn't answer. Delaney answered for him. Just till I figure where next. Etta raised an eyebrow. Plenty of folk in town figuring the same. Delaney's jaw twitched. I'm not folk. No, Etta agreed. But they'll talk like you are. That was the truth of it. The next morning, Boaz rode into town for salt and oats. He didn't linger. Didn't need to. But word had already bloomed like frost across windows. The man who never spoke much had taken in a strange girl, barefoot, bruised, no family. Whispers bent beneath doorways. Deputy Brixby asked casual-like if Boaz needed help at the ranch. When Boaz said no, the deputy leaned on the counter and said, just making sure she's there on her own will. She is, Boaz said. Good. 'Cause Harlan came in riled. Claims she owes him for boarding. Says she ran with his money. Boaz didn't look at the man. Just picked up the sack of oats and walked out. When he returned home, Delaney wasn't in the house. Wasn't in the barn. He found her behind the shed, hands in the cold dirt, planting something in rows too straight to be aimless. What are you doing? He asked. She didn't glance up. There were seeds in the pantry. But I thought, maybe come spring? Her voice caught. She kept her eyes on the earth. I don't know where I'll be come spring, she added. He crouched beside her. Not too close. You can stay. She shook her head. I ain't yours to keep. I didn't say that. The soil clung to her fingers like guilt. People will say things. They already are. She looked at him, eyes tired. Why are you being kind? He didn't answer. Not then. Instead, he stood, brushed the dirt from his palms, and went inside. When he returned, he handed her a pair of boots, worn, laces frayed, but solid. They weren't his wife's. They were his. He'd walked the property line in them for 6 years. He set them down without comment. Delaney touched them like she didn't deserve to, then slipped them on. A week passed. She began sleeping in the bed. He never asked her to. She never thanked him. One night, by the fire, she picked up his wife's sewing basket. He flinched. Not outwardly. Not loud. But she noticed. Her hand froze mid-stitch. I can put it back. He stared at the thread trembling between her fingers. No, he said. She'd like it being used. That night, as the wind howled and the fire flickered like memory, Delaney sang. It was barely more than a hum, an old tune, the kind mothers pass down when babies cry through storm nights, but it filled the cabin like breath. Boaz didn't interrupt. Didn't even look at her. But when she finished, he said, My wife used to sing that when the pipes froze. Delaney didn't reply. She just hummed it once more. Softer. Like a prayer. A few days later, Harlan Price came. Rode up the drive with boots too polished for mud and a grin that didn't belong near fences. Delaney froze at the window. Backed away as if his smile had teeth. Boaz stepped outside before she could speak. You come for the horse? He asked. Harlan dismounted, brushing invisible dust from his coat. I come for what's mine. Boaz didn't move. Got papers? Harlan said, pulling them from inside his coat. Signed by her kin. Her stepbrother. Gave me rights of labor exchange. She's property till her debt's worked off. Boaz took the papers. Read them slow. Folded them smaller. Put them in his coat. She ain't property. She ran, Harlan said. That's breach of contract. I could have the law on this. Then do. For the first time, Harlan's grin cracked. She ain't worth the trouble. You'll see. She'll run again. That's what girls like her do. Boaz turned toward the cabin. Then I'll run too. Harlan left. But Delaney didn't sleep that night. Neither did Boaz. He sat by the hearth. She sat by the door. When the sun finally broke the edge of the hills, she stood. Set a note on the table. Walked out in his old boots, coat cinched tight, head high. The note read, Thank you for never asking me to smile. By the time he read it, she was already halfway to town. But she didn't walk like someone escaping. She walked like someone deciding where her story would go next. And that was something he understood. Because he'd once walked away from his own life too. Not to escape, but to remember what it meant to stay. And now it was her turn. Snow turned to sleet that week. Sharp, stinging drops that pelted roofs like gravel and turned every path into a glaze of misery. Delaney didn't come back the first day or the second. But Boaz checked the road to town each morning, quietly. Not watching. Just noting. He kept her coat hanging by the door. Not because he expected her to return. Because he wasn't ready to believe she wouldn't. Then, 3 nights after the note, he heard a knock. Not timid. Not panicked. Just there. She stood on the porch, soaked to the bone, hair stuck to her cheeks, fingers blue with cold. Her eyes didn't search his face for welcome. Only for space. A question hung between them, unspoken, heavy. Would he let her in again? He stepped aside. She walked past him without a word, dripping on the floorboards. He brought her a towel. She didn't thank him. Just dried her hair in rough motions, her breath sharp and short. What happened? He asked, voice low. Delaney peeled off the damp coat. I asked Etta for work. Boaz nodded once. She turn you down? No. She gave me a needle and 2 shirts to mend. She dropped into the chair by the hearth. Didn't ask questions. Just watched me for a long time like she already knew every one of my answers. Silence stretched. Boaz poured her a cup of tea and set it beside her. She didn't reach for it. Just stared into the fire. She said there's a price to being seen. Boaz leaned against the wall. And you? I ain't figured if I can afford it. Outside, wind rattled the windows. She added, more quietly, Price found me. Boaz's jaw tensed. He tried to grab my arm on the street. Said I made him look like a fool. Said if I wanted to eat without him, I better find papers to prove I ever existed. Did he hurt you? No. A beat passed. Not this time. Boaz took the kettle off the stove and poured a second cup. Set it in front of her again. She still didn't drink. He watched her a while. Longer before he said, You're safe here. She shook her head slowly. No one's safe, Boaz. They're just tolerated or gone. The fire popped. Embers cracked like knuckles. She stared at it as if waiting for it to admit something. That night she didn't sleep in the bed. She took the floor again. Not out of fear. Maybe habit. Maybe because it didn't feel right taking comfort when it hadn't been earned. Boaz left her be. The next morning she was outside splitting wood, coat hanging open, shirt sleeves pushed up to elbows. Her swing was sloppy, but her determination was near violent. He approached slow. She didn't stop. You're gonna wreck your wrist, he said. I ain't breaking. Just burnin' that. He reached for the axe. She jerked it away. Delaney. She stared him down, jaw clenched, eyes glassy. Then suddenly she dropped the axe. Let it fall into the snow with a dull thud. Her shoulders curled inward, like the weight of her own rage had finally folded her. He picked up the axe. Didn't swing. Just held it. You ever had something done to you so long, she whispered, that even when it stops you still wake up choking on it? Boaz didn't speak. I don't want to be scared anymore, she said. He nodded once. Then stop swinging like someone else's ghost is in your arms. She laughed, sharp, breathless. You think I can let go of it that easy? No, he said. I think you've already started. That night she cooked cornbread and stew. She didn't ask permission. Just did it. Moved around the kitchen like she was carving out a place for herself, one spoonful at a time. Boaz sat at the table watching. After supper she reached for the sewing basket. Pulled out a sleeve she'd begun stitching earlier and resumed. Thread slid smooth between fingers, steadier than before. Boaz asked, You ever think of leaving for good? Delaney's eyes didn't lift from the fabric. I did. Every day. Till you untied my hands. And now. She paused. I'm thinking. A beat. He nodded. That's more than most folks ever do. The next day she returned to Etta's shop. This time with her shoulders squared and her hair pinned back. She wore the flannel shirt tucked into a skirt now hemmed to fit. It didn't matter that it was stitched with scraps. It fit her like a quiet flag, one that didn't beg to be noticed but refused to disappear. People stared. But she didn't look away. Etta gave her a table in the back and a stack of mending. Said nothing more than, Your hands'll learn. They did. A week passed. Price kept his distance. But word traveled. Folks said Boaz was living with a woman who didn't belong. That she was someone's kept debt. That she was lucky he hadn't sent her back. Boaz ignored them. Until Deputy Brixby showed up again. Rode in slow. Hat tipped low. Voice quieter than usual. Bo, he said. There's talk now. There's always talk. This kind's louder. They're saying you stole property. Boaz stared at him. She's not property. Doesn't matter what she is to you. Harlan's pulling the law in. Boaz folded his arms. Then let him come himself. He will. Court papers too. You need proof she was mistreated. She was tied up in a stall. Did you see it? Boaz's silence was answer enough. The deputy sighed. It ain't about truth, Bo. It's about who folks believe. When Brixby left, Delaney was already waiting on the porch. She'd heard enough to know the rhythm of injustice by now. I'll go, she said. I won't drag you through a mess. You didn't drag me. I don't want to be the reason your neighbors spit when they see you. They already do. Just used to be over other things. Delaney looked down at her hands. It's never gonna end, is it? Boaz was quiet. Then, you want it to? Her eyes rose slowly. He held out the folded papers Harlan had brought, the ones signed by her stepbrother. They'd been crumpled, dirt-smudged, but still legible. I didn't burn these, he said, because I knew one day you'd want to. She stared at the parchment. Reached for it. Her fingers shook, then steadied. She walked to the fire, held the edge over the flame. It caught slow. Crawled inward like it wasn't sure it was allowed to destroy something so long feared. When it blackened to ash and drifted upward, she watched every curl. Boaz watched her. When she turned, her face wasn't smiling. But it was freer. Not healed. But no longer pretending to be broken. That night she sang again. Not a lullaby this time. A tune with words. Rough-edged, half-remembered lyrics about rivers and women who made it across without help. Her voice cracked in places, but she didn't stop. Boaz sat in the doorway, one leg up on the porch rail, listening. He didn't say a word when she finished. He just tipped his head and for the first time, said her name like it meant something more than a wound. Delaney. She turned. I don't need you to stay, he said. But I'd like to build you a room if you do. She blinked. Not from surprise. but from something deeper. Recognition. Then, with a voice as soft as snowfall, "Boss, I never asked to be rescued. I know. But I wouldn't mind being remembered." He nodded, then went to fetch his hammer. And that was how the fire started to catch. Not all at once. Not with sparks and sparks alone. But with two people building walls that finally felt like they were meant to hold warmth. Not secrets. And if you've ever met someone who didn't try to fix you, just held a door open till you were ready to walk through, then you know. Sometimes, the fire you couldn't light for years just needed someone to hand you the match. The sky hung low over town that morning, swollen with snow that hadn't yet fallen. Light filtered thin through the clouds, casting everything in a hush, the kind of hush that comes before judgment or maybe revelation. Delaney walked down Main Street in Boaz's wife's old red coat, the hem brushing her boots, her shoulders straight, her eyes forward. People stared. Not because she looked wild. She didn't anymore. Not because she was bruised. The marks were gone. They stared because she didn't lower her gaze. Because she had the audacity to walk like she belonged. The coat didn't fit quite right. It clung to her frame like it remembered a different body. But it was warm and it was hers now, not by gift but by survival. She passed the mercantile, the post, the church bell that hadn't rung in weeks. Eyes followed from windows, behind curtains, through gaps in porch railings. Whispers chased her like leaves in wind. "She's the one that ran from Price. I heard she's got the rancher wrapped around her fingers. She was nothing when she got here. She still is." Delaney didn't flinch. Her face held no defiance, just dignity, heavy and deliberate. She turned into Etta McCraw's shop. The bell above the door jangled like a warning. Etta looked up from the counter and said nothing at first. Just glanced at the clock, then nodded to the pile of mending waiting in the back. "You're early," she said. "Had something to prove," Delaney replied, shrugging off the coat and folding it neatly on a chair. Etta watched her, long and quiet. "You'll have to prove it again tomorrow?" "I plan to." The room was still. Needles lay scattered across a pincushion like tiny bayonets. Outside, the murmurs grew louder. It happened sometime around noon. Harlan Price walked into town. Not in a rush. Not in a rage. Just calm and slick and righteous. Like he thought the town owed him silence. He spotted her through the shop window. Marched in without knocking, without asking. The bell above the door screamed as he pushed through. "There you are," he said. Delaney froze, fingers mid-thread. Etta set her scissors down, slowly. "You think you can humiliate me?" Harlan snarled. "You think you can just show your face like you didn't steal from me? You're still mine, girl." Delaney rose. Not fast. Not shaking. "I'm not yours," she said. Harlan reached for her. A grab, not a touch. That's when the door opened again. "Boaz." He stood there in his canvas coat, hat still dusted with snow, boots wet from the creek crossing. His hands were empty, but his presence was heavy. He didn't shout. Didn't draw. He just stepped between them. "She told you no," Boaz said. "She's a liar. She's free." Harlan scoffed. "She's a stray. You're keeping her like a dog and calling it charity." Boaz stared at him. No expression. Just that endless, unreadable quiet he carried like armor. "Then why you so scared of her walking through town?" People had gathered outside now. Not pretending anymore. Just standing there, watching through the windows, pretending it wasn't their business while leaning in with breath held. "I have signed paper," Harlan said, pulling a crumpled sheet from his coat. "Legal claim." Etta stepped out from behind the counter. "And I saw you drag her into that stall 2 months ago. She had no shoes. You shut the door and bolted it from the outside. That's slander." "Then sue me." Another voice joined. "Mrs. Norling from the bakery. I saw you pass an envelope to that deputy. Few dollars more than a horse's worth. Y'all are making a mistake." Boaz's voice was quiet, dangerous. "You already did." The bell jingled again. Deputy Brixby. He stepped in with a ledger under one arm and sweat already beating at his temples. He didn't look at Boaz. Didn't look at Harlan. Just said, "I got new orders." County judge reviewed the affidavits. He cleared his throat. "Harlan Price, you're to come with me." Harlan's mouth opened, then shut. He looked around and realized, maybe for the first time, that no one was stepping forward for him. Not the grocer. Not the pastor. Not even the law. Delaney didn't smile. Didn't speak. She just stepped back. Watched him leave. Watched everything she'd feared shrink down into the size of a man who couldn't stand sunlight. Boaz turned to her. Held her gaze. Didn't touch her. Didn't need to. Outside, the town was still again. But not with fear. With quiet reckoning. Etta returned to her counter. Mrs. Norling to her bread. Life resumed, but something had shifted. Delaney picked up her red coat. Folded it over her arm. She walked outside, not hiding. Boaz followed. A step behind. Not as her guard. As her equal. They reached the wagon. Snow began to fall, soft as sifted flour. She paused at the rail. Looked at the horizon, where the gray of sky met the white of field. Then turned to him. "Why did you follow me that day?" she asked. He took a long breath. "Because some things don't need a reason. Just a right moment." She nodded. They didn't ride home right away. They stood there in the stillness, letting the cold bite and the silence settle. And if you've ever watched someone walk through fire and come out carrying nothing but their name, then you already know what Boaz knew. You don't save a woman like that. You just walk beside her long enough until she starts believing she was never lost. The sky broke open the day Delaney chose to stay. Snow had been falling since dawn, thick and silent, blanketing every fence post, every roof shingle, every split board in the barn that had once held her like a coffin. By midday, the land looked reborn, clean, hushed, and holy in the way only winter can manage. She stood by the fence, breath clouding around her like steam, watching the hills blur into white. Boaz was chopping wood nearby, sleeves rolled past his elbows, sweat darkening his collar even in the cold. Neither of them spoke. Words had begun to feel like bridges that didn't always need crossing. She didn't tell him she wasn't leaving. He didn't ask. But he saw the way she'd unpacked the small tin comb from her satchel and left it by the wash basin. Saw her boots, drying by the fire, not near the door but tucked in beside his. Saw her hand stitching new curtains from old linen, no pattern, just instinct. Quiet declarations. Gentle claims. That evening she found him in the barn, hammering a new beam into the frame of what used to be a broken stall. "You fixing it for a new horse?" she asked. He paused. Turned slowly, eyes soft but unreadable. "No." She stepped closer. The barn smelled of old wood and snow melt. She ran her hand along the edge of the beam. It was smooth, clean. He watched her fingers trace the grain. Thought maybe it should be something else now. Like what? A pantry. Or a root cellar. Maybe a cradle. Depends what the house needs next. She didn't laugh. But something in her face softened, like a thaw just beneath the skin. Her fingers stopped. Rested flat against the beam. "I don't want to be someone you rescued," she said. "You're not. I don't want pity. Or charity." He set the hammer down. "You ever seen me hand out either?" Delaney looked at him then. Not the way a woman sizes a man up. Not the way she once looked at danger. But the way someone looks when they've stopped running and want to know what happens next. "I didn't come here to be yours," she whispered. "But I don't want to leave and forget you either." Boaz moved a step closer, enough for the cold to warm between them. "I don't want you to be mine," he said. "I want you to be here. If that's what you want." Her breath hitched. "Can you build something with someone?" she asked, "even when both of you are still broken in places?" "Only then," he said. "That's the only way it holds." That night they didn't talk much. She made supper, beans and cornbread and something sweet with dried apples, and he stoked the fire until it danced like it had waited years to be noticed. They sat at the table, eating in companionable silence, the kind of silence that fills rather than empties. Later, she took down his wife's old wedding shawl from the hook by the window, folded it gently, pressed it into a drawer. Not to erase the woman who came before, but to make space for the woman who came after. He noticed, said nothing. But when he stepped onto the porch, he left the door open behind him. A small thing. But she felt it like an invitation. Snow had stopped falling. Moonlight glazed the fields in silver. She stepped outside and stood beside him. They looked out across the land, not at what had been taken from them but what might still be built. "Boaz," she said after a long silence, if I really stayed, what would you want from me?" He didn't answer right away. He just watched the wind swirl through the trees, then finally looked at her, steady and sure. "A name on the deed. A cup on the shelf. A hand I can reach for when the night gets long. Nothing more." She exhaled, sharp and trembling. "That's everything." He nodded once. Later, in the cabin's warmth, she brushed her hair beside the fire, the way she used to when no one was looking. Only this time someone was. Boaz sat in the chair across from her, his hands resting on his knees, just watching, not to claim, not to judge. Just to witness. The sacred act of seeing without demanding. She smiled then. A real one. Small. Crooked. Earned. And that's when he reached beneath the table and slid a folded paper toward her. A deed. Half the land. Half the house. Signed with his name. She stared at it like it might vanish if she blinked. I didn't do anything to deserve this, she said. No one ever does, he replied. That's why it means something. The wind howled outside, but inside it was quiet. So, true. She didn't cry. But her hands trembled as she folded the paper and placed it beside her plate. And he didn't ask if she'd stay, because she already had. That night she slept in the bed. And he slept on the floor, just once more, because some transitions need to happen with grace. But in the morning when she woke, he was beside her. Fully clothed. Boots still on. But there. And she didn't pull away. They lay in silence, eyes open, facing the wood ceiling. When she spoke, her voice was barely louder than the wind. You ever think some people were never meant to be saved, but maybe just held until they could stand up on their own? He turned his head. Met her gaze. That's the only kind I've ever trusted. The fire still crackled. Outside, fresh snow glistened untouched. But inside, something had finally landed. And reader, if you've ever mistaken a roof for a home or a house for safety, then you know by now. What you call a home ain't always a place with walls. Sometimes, it's the silence that lets you heal. Sometimes, it's the man who doesn't ask questions, just builds you a door you can close from the inside. And sometimes, it's the red coat hanging by that door, a little worn, a little faded, proof you walked through something no one else did and came out whole. So if you ever find someone who sees you not for what you were, but for what you're still becoming, stay. Because you found the kind of home that can't burn down. The dirt beneath her feet was cracked from heat, the kind of heat that made skin sting and thoughts scatter. She stood barefoot, knees dusted in grime, a crooked wooden sign clutched tight in both hands, $50, as if it might shield her from the dozens of eyes watching, judging, smirking. Her dress was the color of old wheat, torn at the hem and dark with stains no one had bothered to wash out. But her gaze, though quiet, didn't flinch. She looked forward as if nothing about the day could surprise her anymore. Calder Briggs had seen 1,000 sunrises since his wife burned. None of them felt warm. He rode into town with the same intention as always. Get what's needed, don't speak unless you must, and leave before someone remembers your name. The general store was half-stocked, but that didn't matter. All he needed was salt, jerky, and the tobacco his hands shook for come nightfall. He tied his horse out front, ignoring the gawking crowd gathering along the main road. Then he saw her. She wasn't crying. Wasn't pleading. Just standing there like she'd already been hanged, and this was the after. The men around her barked jokes, the kind that stick to your skin like grease. A boy no older than 12 spat in the dirt and said loud enough, $50? Ain't even worth the wood the signs printed on. Calder paused. Not because he cared. He hadn't cared for months. Maybe years. But something in the way she held that sign, not as an offer but as a fact, tapped a place in him that hadn't stirred since the night the fire took everything but his name. She's a labor girl, the man beside him muttered. Family run off. Or sold her. Makes no difference now. Another voice called out from the crowd. What's she good for? She can't even smile. Someone laughed. Calder's boots moved before his thoughts did. He stepped into the circle, straight toward her. She didn't blink. Her eyes were a strange, muted green, the color of sagebrush after rain, if you were the sort to notice such things. He wasn't. Not anymore. He looked at the auctioneer. 50. The man laughed like he'd heard a joke too early. You serious? I ain't joking. Then she's yours. No ceremony. No paperwork. Just the rustle of shame as the crowd lost interest and started dispersing like cattle after a thunderclap. One woman whispered something to her child and turned away, as if shielding her little one from the sight of a girl too poor to cost more than a sack of flour. Calder turned to her. You comin'? Still no blink. But she stepped off the crate barefoot and followed him. Her sign dropped with a hollow clatter against the dust. They didn't speak as they walked to his horse. He pulled himself into the saddle, then reached down without looking. She hesitated, then took his hand. He pulled her up behind him with the same care he might have used to load a sack of grain. Balanced, efficient, detached. They rode out of town with no one waving goodbye. The sun beat down hard, unrelenting. The road was long and flat and brown. She clung to nothing. Not his waist. Not the horse. Just sat still behind him like she didn't care whether she fell off or disappeared. After a mile, Calder spoke. What's your name? No answer. I'll call you girl if that's what you want. Silence. Then, softer than dust on glass, Elsie. All right. More silence. The only sound was the horse's hooves and the dry rasp of wind brushing over brittle grass. "You got people?" he asked. "No. You run from someone?" "I was given." He didn't ask what that meant. Some truths are shaped too jagged to touch without bleeding. Hours passed. The sun tilted west. His ranch came into view, a weather-beaten stretch of land with a barn leaning like a drunk, a house missing half its porch rail, and a corral that hadn't seen a live horse in weeks. She didn't react. Not to the emptiness. Not to the neglect. Not even to the silence that seemed stitched into the land itself. He helped her off the horse, watched her wince as her feet touched ground again. He gestured to the house. "Water pumps out back. Firewood's by the shed. I'll fix a meal." She nodded once and walked toward the pump. Not a word. Not a question. Just a quiet acceptance that this was life now. Inside he stared at the skillet like it owed him something. Cooking hadn't been the same since Mary died. He used to make cornbread, beans with ham, even pies on Sundays. Now just fried potatoes and silence. When she came in, her hair was damp from rinsing off the dust. Her dress clung slightly to her ribs, showing how thin she truly was. But she didn't ask for more food when he set the plate down. She just ate like someone used to hunger. That night, she took the corner of the room closest to the door. Slept on a folded blanket, curled like a child. He watched her for a long time from the rocker by the fire. Not because he wanted anything, just because something about her stillness felt familiar. A mirror maybe. At some point near dawn, she muttered in her sleep. One word, "Don't." He didn't ask what it meant. He never would. Instead, he looked out the window toward the dry hills and thought about how grief doesn't leave. It just changes shape. Sometimes into fire. Sometimes into a girl with a sign and no shoes. He didn't buy her to save her. He didn't buy her for company. Hell, he didn't even know why he spoke up. But as the embers dimmed and her breathing settled into rhythm, he whispered something he hadn't said in years, words that tasted foreign in his mouth. "You're safe now." And in the morning, when she rose before him and lit the fire, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, fate had changed its mind. Elsie didn't cry the first night. She didn't cry the second either. And by the third, Calder began to wonder if she'd ever done so at all. She worked with quiet hands, mending his torn shirts with stitches so small and neat they could have been drawn with pencil. At dawn, he'd hear the scrape of the old kettle, her bare feet against the floorboards, the soft cough she tried to muffle behind her sleeve. There was no singing, no humming. No idle chatter as Mary once filled the rooms with. Only the steady rhythm of motion. The land didn't ask questions and neither did Calder. But questions had a way of curling in the corners of your mind, like smoke from an old chimney that never quite clears. He watched her one morning from the porch, her figure hunched over the clothesline, pinning damp fabric with trembling fingers. She tied his shirt sleeves with knots instead of clips, her hands too stiff from the cold to do much else. She never asked for gloves. Never asked for anything. When he brought her a cup of coffee, she didn't thank him. Just took it, wrapped her hands around it like warmth was a new language. "You ever live on land before?" he asked. She shook her head. "Cellar mostly. Then back rooms." "What kind of cellar?" "The kind where you're told not to scream." He didn't press. But she'd given him a piece of something. A shard of truth. That was more than she'd given the world in days. Maybe more than the world had ever given her. After that, he made space, quiet ones, for her to speak if she wanted to. He didn't hover. Didn't pry. He just sat on the porch, carved wood in his hands, and let the silence work like a plow turning earth. Sometimes she joined him. Just sat. Just breathed. Just existed. And somehow that was enough. One afternoon, while chopping firewood, Calder caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the fence line. His instincts tightened. Old trouble still breathing. A rider paused just beyond the trees, then turned back. No approach. No message. Just watching. He didn't mention it to Elsie. Not yet. Instead, he checked the locks on the barn door that night, reinforced the latches on the front windows. Loaded the rifle and leaned it near the hearth. Elsie noticed. Said nothing. But her movements that night were slower, more careful. Her shoulders drew tighter, as if bracing for something she'd seen before. Calder laid out 2 plates for supper. She sat across from him, cradling a tin fork in her hand like it might shatter if she moved wrong. "You don't need to flinch in this house," he said. "I don't flinch," she replied. He studied her, then nodded. "All right." A beat. Then she said it. Quiet. Firm. "I wait." "For what?" "For when the good turns bad." He didn't argue. How could he? She wore her history like a second skin, tight, scarred, familiar. He had one too. but something in the way she spoke it, not bitter, not angry, just honest. It made him feel like maybe they weren't as different as he once thought. The next day she stitched a patch on his work pants without being asked, left them folded on his bed. The day after he carved a small figurine, a horse no bigger than a matchbox, and left it near her water bucket. Neither mentioned the axe. Neither needed to. A kind of language was growing between them. Not made of words but gestures. Quiet ones. That week a neighbor stopped by. Jeb hollow, mouth always full of something, chew lies or opinions. He rode up just as Calder was splitting logs, grinning like he'd stumbled onto something worth retelling in town. "Well, I'll be," Jeb said, leaning from his saddle. "You got yourself a girl now, eh? She cooked too? Or just good for the hayloft?" Calder didn't look up. Just swung the axe. Crack. Another log split clean. Jeb chuckled. $50. Hell, I paid more for my dog. That's when Elsie stepped out from the house. She wasn't made up, wasn't trying to impress. Her dress still bore flour from baking, her hands dusted with wood ash. But she stood tall, chin up, eyes clear. Jeb's laughter faded. Calder walked toward him, slow and steady. He leaned a hand on the saddle horn and said in a voice that didn't need raising, "You ought to leave now, Jeb. Before you say something your teeth regret." Jeb swallowed. Didn't mean nothing by it. Still time to mean less. And with that, Jeb turned his horse and rode off. Elsie didn't speak of it afterward. But that night, she left half a biscuit on Calder's plate without comment. The next morning she handed him his coffee with both hands. He didn't say thank you. But he drank it slower than usual. Then came the moment that shifted everything. He found her in the barn 2 nights later, curled in the hay, clutching something in her fist. Her breath was shallow, her frame shaking, not from cold but from the weight of memory. Calder stepped close, unsure if she was asleep or guarding silence. Then she opened her hand. Inside, a locket. Bent, scratched but still clinging to a chain. He didn't ask who was inside. He didn't need to. She didn't look at him. Just whispered, "I used to pray to be sold. Figured any place was better than where I was. Turns out, there's worse than wishing for escape. There's getting it." He didn't know what to say. Words were too sharp, too clumsy. So he did the one thing he could. Took off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "You ain't property, Elsie." She didn't answer. But she leaned ever so slightly into the coat. Into the warmth. That was all. Just that. And in the quiet hum of the night, in the smell of hay and old wood, Calder sat beside her like a man rediscovering the sound of his own heart. She didn't cry. Not yet. But that night she didn't sleep alone. And when the morning came she was the first to light the stove, whistle low under her breath, and place 2 mugs on the table. One for him, one for her. A rhythm was forming. Not love. Not yet. But something gentler. Something that might one day grow into the kind of love that doesn't ask questions, doesn't demand promises, just shows up and stays. The kind of love that survives without crying. Because it knows the silence is full of meaning. And because somewhere in the distance, past the fence line, the trouble was still watching. But they were ready to meet it. Together. The first real storm rolled in without warning. No smell of rain on the wind. No shift in bird calls. Just a sudden crack of sky and the sharp scent of lightning as it split the clouds open like a curse. The wind hit the house hard, rattling the shutters, and a dust cloud curled across the valley like a ghost trying to rise. Elsie was in the yard, hauling firewood into the shed when the gusts slammed against her back. She stumbled but didn't cry out. Didn't flinch. She just dropped the wood, wiped her brow, and went back for more. Inside, Calder watched through the window, one hand wrapped around a steaming mug. He should have called her in. Should have yelled. But something about the way she moved, quick, efficient, determined, kept him quiet. She didn't ask for help. She never did. And he didn't offer unless it mattered. The storm would matter. By dusk the wind had teeth. The roof groaned, the barn door buckled, and the hens wouldn't settle. The kind of weather that didn't just pass, it tested things. Hinges. Fences. People. Calder nailed planks across the windows while Elsie filled every pail and bucket with water, just in case. She was quick on her feet, moving like a girl who knew what it meant to run out of time. "Storm cellar's full of mold," he told her as he secured the final board. "Ain't been cleaned since before Mary passed. I'll take mold over sky falling." He almost smiled. Almost. "Then we'll take our chances in the barn." Lightning danced across the horizon like it was showing off. The thunder followed close, low and angry. They moved to the barn just as the first sheets of rain came down, fast and cold and slicing. Inside, it smelled of wet hay and old sorrow. The horses fidgeted in their stalls. A loose shutter outside banged in rhythm, and the lantern flickered low. Elsie sat on an upturned crate, arms wrapped around her knees. Her dress was soaked through, plastered to her like second skin. Calder handed her a dry blanket, then settled across from her on a stack of feed sacks. "You always this calm in storms?" she asked. "Storms don't care how calm you are," he said. "Best you can do is hold your breath and wait it out." She nodded, quiet for a long while. Then, "My father used to lock me in the root cellar when it stormed. Said the house had to be for him and the good children." Calder's jaw clenched. "I counted the seconds between thunder and flash. That's how I knew how close it was." She gave a tight smile. "One time it hit a tree just above the trapdoor. I thought I'd been buried." He looked at her, saw the flicker of memory swimming behind her eyes, but she didn't cry. Not even then. "I hate storms," she said simply. "Me too." They sat like that for a while. Rain hammering down. Wind howling. The world outside turned to blur and violence, but inside there was just breath and silence and a stubborn sort of peace. Until the shot rang out. One crack, clean and close. Calder shot to his feet. He grabbed the rifle from behind the door and moved without speaking. Elsie followed, barefoot and steady, her eyes wide but not afraid. Outside, they saw nothing at first, just the storm's chaos. Then, beyond the fence line, a flash of movement. A man on horseback. Another behind him. "Not lightning," Calder muttered. "Not thunder." Elsie stepped closer. "You think it's Case?" "Could be. Or someone like him." He raised the rifle but didn't fire. "Not yet." The riders didn't come closer. Just circled. "Watch. They're testing us," she said. He nodded. "Seeing how many are here. How ready we are." "We're not." "Nope." But he raised the rifle anyway, aimed high, and fired one warning shot into the sky. The riders pulled back into the dark. For now. Back in the barn, Elsie sat on the floor, knees tucked close, shivering from wet clothes and something deeper. Calder poured her a sip of whiskey from a flask he hadn't touched in weeks. She drank without hesitation, coughed once, then passed it back. "You think they'll come again?" she asked. "They didn't come to say howdy." He sat beside her, their shoulders close, sharing the heat from the blanket. It wasn't comfort. Not exactly. But it was something to lean on. "I don't want to run again," she whispered. "You won't." "I mean it, Calder. If they come for me, they'll have to go through me." She turned her face toward him. There wasn't hope in her eyes, not yet, but there was trust. A fragile thread, thin as cobweb, but there. "I'm not what you think I am," she said. "I don't think you're anything," he replied. "I just see what's in front of me." She gave him a look he couldn't name. Then she leaned against him. Not much. Just enough to let him know she was tired of holding herself up. Outside the storm raged. But inside, for the first time, she let herself rest against another person. The next morning dawned strange and silent. The kind of quiet that follows breaking. Their fence had been trampled in places. The barn's back door hung off its hinges. One of the chickens was missing. But nothing worse. Calder walked the perimeter with the rifle slung over his shoulder. Elsie followed, a hammer in hand. They didn't speak much. Didn't need to. He pounded the nails. She held the boards. By mid-morning the sky cleared. Birds returned. The wind slowed. In the afternoon, Elsie found a small bluebird caught in the coop wire, wing bent wrong, eyes wide with fear. She could have left it. Could have looked away. But she didn't. She crouched, murmured something soft, and unwrapped the wire strand. Calder watched her through the slats of the fence. Watched the gentleness in her hands. The care. She carried the bird inside, made a nest of cloth scraps, and set it on the windowsill where the sun touched the floor. It wouldn't fly again. But it wouldn't die alone. That night she sat beside him on the porch. He passed her a plate. She passed him a cup. The rhythm was forming again. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "I used to. And now? I ain't ready to bury another name." She nodded, slow and sure. "Then, if they come again, we fight?" He looked at her, saw the fire there. Not anger. Just survival. "We fight," he said. She smiled. Not wide. Not bright. But real. The kind of smile that comes after storms. The kind that knows peace doesn't last, but still chooses to sit in it while it's here. And behind her, on the windowsill, the little bird blinked in the sunlight, breathing. Still breathing. So were they. The man came riding in under a yellow sky, his dust trailing behind him like a tail of smoke. He wore a black coat despite the heat, sleeves too fine for labor, hat too stiff for wind. A man who smelled like ink, paper, and the kind of money earned by bleeding others. Elsie saw him before Calder did. She was hauling water, her arms sore from the morning's work, when her body froze, not from fear but recognition. Her fingers gripped the pail so tight the metal rim cut into her palm. Calder stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He followed her gaze and went still. The rider pulled his horse to a stop just outside the fence. Come. Confident. His boots didn't even carry dust when he stepped down. Mr. Briggs, he said, tipping his hat like this was some social call. Fine land you've got here. Quiet too. Calder said nothing. The man turned, looked at Elsie with slow, deliberate eyes. And Miss Elsie. Still alive, I see. That's a surprise. Elsie didn't move. Didn't blink. But her voice, when it came, was a whisper cut with ice. Benton. He grinned like a man who never earned one thing honestly in his life. Your debts didn't vanish just because some fool took you in. Paperwork doesn't rot the way people do. Calder stepped forward. What debts? Benton pulled a folded sheet from inside his coat and let it fall open like a magician revealing his trick. Right here. Signed contract. Labor bond issued in Abilene. Girl sold to me for the sum of $200. Until it's paid, she's mine. She's not, Calder said, voice flat. Benton chuckled. Law says otherwise. You think law rides with men like you? Benton's grin faltered. Men like me built the law out here. Elsie stepped between them then, her hands trembling but her chin high. I paid you in bruises. In blood. In everything but money. That should make us even. You don't decide when a debt's cleared, Benton said. Calder's rifle was already by the door. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. But his jaw locked. You're not welcome here. Leave now. I'll be back, Benton said, mounting again. With men. With papers. Maybe with fire if it comes to that. You've got 3 days. He rode off like he'd done the world a favor. That night, the ranch was still, but the silence had teeth. Calder poured 2 drinks. Elsie didn't touch hers. She stood by the hearth, arms folded, the flicker of firelight catching the scars at the edge of her wrist. Should have known he'd come for me, she muttered. He won't take you, Calder said. You don't know what men like him do. What they buy. What they break. I don't need to. He ain't taking you. She looked at him, then really looked. You bought me too. I didn't buy you. I bought your chance to breathe. He stood, moved to her side. I've buried more than I care to count. I ain't burying you. Her lip trembled, but still she didn't cry. They began preparing before first light. Calder patched the fencing. Elsie gathered tools, salted meat, filled jars. She moved with purpose, her steps heavier, shoulders straighter. I won't hide, she said. You won't have to. At midday, Jeb Hollow rode up with a pack mule and a grin. Heard cases kicking dirt again. Figured I'd bring something useful. What's that? Calder asked. 2 rifles, 1 bottle, and my ornery charm. Jeb dismounted and tossed them a battered rifle. Never did like that bastard. His breath smells like ink and his words like rot. Elsie smirked. The first real one Calder had ever seen from her. Thanks, Jeb, she said. Don't thank me yet, he replied. I shoot like a drunk squirrel. They built makeshift barricades near the barn and house. Nothing fancy, just boards and wire, but enough to slow men down. Calder taught Elsie how to reload. Jeb showed her how to aim fast and dirty. The days passed in the rhythm of dread. On the 3rd night, Calder couldn't sleep. He stood on the porch, watching the horizon. The moon was just a sliver, like a cut not yet scabbed over. Elsie joined him, barefoot, her shawl wrapped tight. I used to dream of being bought, she said. Not for love. Just for escape. Thought maybe someone would see me and say, she's worth more than the seller. She looked at him then. You didn't say it. But you showed it. Calder's voice came rough. Don't matter what you were. Just who you are now. She reached out slow and took his hand. You think we'll make it through tomorrow? I've made it through worse. So have you. At dawn, dust rose on the southern road. 5 riders. 1 wagon. Benton led them, his coat still black, face still smug. The men behind him looked hard. Paid muscle. Hands who didn't ask questions. They dismounted just outside rifle range. You got my girl, Briggs. And I got the law. You've got nothing, Calder called back. Not even your name once the town hears it. Benton raised his hand and 2 men flanked wide. Calder raised his rifle. The standoff began. Wind stirred the grass. Somewhere a hawk cried out. Then a shot rang. One of Benton's men fired early, missing wide. Calder returned fire, and the second shot dropped a rider clean from his saddle. Gunfire lit the air. Wood splintered. Dust kicked up. Elsie fired twice, then reloaded with trembling hands. Jeb hooped as he fired from behind the barn, cursing Benton's ancestry with every shot. A bullet tore through the edge of the porch. Another grazed Calder's arm. Then it ended as fast as it began. Benton's men retreated, dragging their wounded. Only one stayed down. Benton himself rode off, his face pale, shouting back curses no one listened to. When the dust settled, the ranch was scarred, but still standing. Elsie collapsed to her knees in the dirt. Not from fear. From something deeper. Release. Calder crouched beside her, hands on her shoulders. You're safe. She looked up at him. Her lips parted. And finally, after all the silence, after all the storms, she wept. Not like a girl. Like a woman who'd been caged, sold, silenced, and was finally free. The morning after the shootout, the ranch stood quieter than ever, too quiet as if even the wind had paused to breathe. A stray bullet had shattered the porch railing. One of the hens hadn't returned. The barn roof bore a fresh hole where smoke still lingered. But the men were gone. Benton had vanished like all cowards do, loud on approach, silent on retreat. Calder sat on the porch steps, arm wrapped in a blood-stained bandage, the rifle resting across his lap. His boots were still caked in yesterday's dust. Beside him, Elsie poured water into a chipped basin and washed his wound with a touch gentler than he'd ever known. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He studied her hands, how steady they'd become. Not the girl from the auction block. Not the quiet shadow who flinched at laughter. But a woman rooted, defiant, unbending. And if he were honest, it scared him a little. Not her strength, but the way it had slipped into his life like sunlight into a cold room, slow, unnoticed, and suddenly everything. Can you move your fingers? She asked. He flexed them. Well enough to dig a grave. She gave him a look. No more graves today. He nodded. The town sent word by dusk. Sheriff Henley had heard about the fight, how Case's men drew first. How Benton had fled. How a hired gun had confessed before dying in the saloon that night. No charges. No law left to twist. Just a line in the dirt that said, she belongs to no one. Calder burned the contract that night without ceremony. No fire pit, no speech, just a single match, a tin pail, and the brittle hush of a page curling into black. Elsie watched from the doorway. She didn't cheer. She didn't sigh. But something in her eyes shifted. A closing of an old rusted gate. A release. Over the next week, they mended the fence together. Repainted the porch. Jeb stopped by with 2 planks and a dozen nosy questions, most of which were ignored. He left with a grin anyway. Calder built her a dresser. Not because she asked. Because her clothes deserved more than a nail on a wall. She baked for the first time, surprising even herself. The biscuits came out too hard, but Calder ate 3 without comment. She didn't say thank you. He didn't say they were terrible. That was their language now, unspoken gratitude, shared space. They still didn't sleep in the same room. But the space between rooms had grown warmer, fuller. One evening, Elsie found him in the barn, sanding a piece of oak with a kind of patience that only came to men who'd learned to lose everything. Building something? She asked. He looked up. Maybe. What is it? He hesitated. Rocking chair. Mary used to sit one on the porch. A beat passed. She would have liked you, he added. I'm not sure I would have liked her, Elsie replied, honest as ever. He chuckled. Then I guess we're even. She reached out, ran her hand along the smooth wood. You ever think about leaving all this behind? The land. The memories. I used to. Now I think about planting. That made her pause. Then she said, Spring's coming. It always does. That night she stood at his door, barefoot and still. He looked up from his bed, and before either could speak, she walked in, crossed the floor, and sat beside him. No words. Just the weight of her presence, deliberate and steady. He didn't reach for her. But she leaned into him, shoulder to shoulder. And after a long silence she whispered, I'm not afraid anymore. He turned his head, just enough for their eyes to meet in the dark. I was never your savior, he said. I just opened the door. You didn't have to. I know. She touched his hand then, not shyly, not as a question, but as something claimed. And he held it. The calluses on their palms aligned like puzzle pieces worn by different storms. The following day they rode into town together for supplies. It was the first time she entered the mercantile without a sideways glance or a tightened jaw. People stared, Of course they did. But not with the same heat. Not with the same pity. Word had spread. Elsie was no one's property. And Calder? He'd fought for her in a way few men ever did, by standing beside her, not in front of her. As they left the shop, she looked back at the dusty street where she once stood with that wooden sign in her hands, barefoot and unwanted. A child passed her now, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, is that the girl from the story?" Elsie met the mother's gaze. The woman smiled, nodded once, and the child waved. Elsie didn't wave back. But her chin lifted. The past didn't vanish. But it no longer clung. That evening she found Calder working by lantern light, tightening a bolt on the new gate. "I think we should get married," she said plainly. He blinked once, wiped his hands on his pants. "You sure?" "No. But I'm not scared either. That's enough for me." There was no ceremony. No preacher. Just 2 rings carved from old copper coins, a kiss under the cottonwood, and a shared plate of beans eaten straight from the pot. They laughed that night. Laughed hard. The kind that leaves your ribs aching and your heart new again. And when the laughter faded and the house grew quiet, Calder said the words he'd kept for no one but her. "You saved me too, Elsie. You just did it slower." She looked at him, eyes full but dry, and whispered, "That's how real things grow." In the seasons that followed, they planted corn and kept bees. She sang to the garden. He carved toys in case they ever needed them. The wind still came. The storms too. But this time they didn't break anything. Not her. Not him. Not the home they'd built from a girl no one wanted, and a man who thought he was done living. And if you ask the neighbors, they'll tell you she changed his life. But Calder, sitting on that porch, coffee in hand and her laughter drifting from the kitchen, would say, "No. She gave it back."